The Rose of the World by W.B. Yeats. Who dreamed that beauty passes like a dream? For these red lips with all their mournful pride, mournful that no new wonder may betide, Troy passed away in one high funeral gleam, and Usna's children died. We and the labouring world are passing by, amid men's souls that wavering give place like the pale waters in their wintry race. Under the passing stars, foam of the sky lives on this lonely face. Bow down, archangels, in your dim abode. Before you were, or any hearts to beat, weary and kind, one lingered by his seat. He made the world to be a grassy road before her wandering feet. The Second Coming by W.B. Yeats. Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the centre cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world, the blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Surely some revelation is at hand, surely the second coming is at hand. The second coming. Hardly are those words out when a vast image out of Spiritus Mundi troubles my sight. Somewhere in the sands of the desert a shape with lion body, and the head of a man, a gaze blank and pitiless as the sun, is moving its slow thighs, while all about it reel shadows of the indignant desert birds. The darkness drops again, but now I know that 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle, and what rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouches towards Bethlehem to be born. Well, I've just read two poems by the same author, W.B. Yeats, and I think they're worth offering some comments on, having a discussion about as well. And I'd love to hear what anyone listening thinks, so post in the comments or get in touch. So first, W.B. Yeats, who lived from 1865 to 1939. He was Irish. He fell in love when still young with Irish folk tales and legends, and he was an ardent Irish nationalist. And he bridges two periods in English language literature. First, a period which maybe we could call late Romantic, with the Victorian and Georgian poets, and the second period, Modernism. To offer, really cheap one-sentence summary, Romanticism generally emphasised the emotional life, tradition in the form of folk tales and legends, and musical regular form, while Modernism emphasised the intellectual life, tradition in the form of reformulating classics and institutions, and complex, often irregular poetic forms. And that's very simplistic, and of course it's not that every poet who lived between 1865 and 1939 was either a romantic or a modernist or some mixture. That there are sub-strands and sub-themes, but that's a good overview for us, I think, for our comparison, because Yeats moves in both circles, and we'll see that with the two poems that we're going to look at. Let's talk about each of those poems then in turn. So first, we read Rose of the World. Rose of the World was printed in 1893, so Yeats was 28. It's a love poem, of course, and underneath the mythical language, it's obvious that it's a love poem. It was written about or to Maud Gunn, Yeats's great love. Maud Gunn was either an exciting or a horrifying character, depending on your taste, but she was undoubtedly a romantic. She was devoted to the twin causes of Irish independence and artistic beauty, even connecting the two by arguing that the English stunted Irish art and so needed resisting on that basis. So the two causes were connected in how she treated Yeats as well. She refused his marriage proposals, partly because he was insufficiently devoted to nationalism for her, but also because his misery spurred his artistic excellence. And we can see her impact on his life here. See in the first verse how beauty is connected to destruction and to misery. For these red lips, he says, meaning beauty personified in Maud Gunn, Troy passed away in one high funeral gleam. Maud is poetically Helen of Troy reincarnate, which would also please Maud, convinced as she was of the reality of reincarnation. But there's also ecstasy and a sort of safety in her beauty. There's an eternity to her lonely face, which is worthy of angelic adoration. Indeed, God himself made the world to be a grassy road before her wandering feet. Um, she is both a human being who Yeats is in love with, but she personifies or is the incarnation of an eternal principle. Also note the way the poem is formed or patterned. It has a regular pattern of rhymes in each verse and a regular number of syllables to be sounded in each line. The verse pattern is A, B, B, A, B, which means that the first and the fourth lines rhyme and the second, third and fifth lines rhyme. And in each verse, the first 4 lines have 10 sounded syllables and the last line has 6. The imagery, while excellent and striking, it's not jarring or unusual, is it? It isn't a fresh formulation. Yeats leans on what amounts to a cliché, that beauty is destructive, with the particular example of Helen of Troy, the face that launched 1,000 ships, the most famous and obvious example of beauty you can imagine. So we're looking at, let's call it a very romantic poem. A poem about beauty and about love, about regular form. This beauty is expressed partly through the regular rhythm and form of the poem. The imagery, as I say, though good, is not completely new. It's not a reformulation of tradition, it is tradition. And Romanticism, though in part it was a rebellious or countercultural movement at its roots, it was also one that sought to reclaim traditions. You see that as far back as the 1750s and the Ossian poems, which were allegedly Scottish folk tales, which were one of the first great romantic artefacts. Now, what about the Second Coming? We can immediately feel, I think, a difference with this poem. The themes are very different, the way it sounds is very different, the whole effect is very different. And of course, a poet can have great variety between different poems, but in this case, it's more than just variety. It's almost as if you have a different mind at work. Of course, it's not, and there are some connections, but they're so different. This was written in 1919, 26 years after Rose of the World. Yeats is much older now, in his mid-50s. World War I has just ended. The Irish War of Independence has just begun. The Bolsheviks are in power in Moscow. Civilization seemed to be, indeed it was, collapsing. A few years later, we'll see that seminal work of modernism, Eliot's The Wasteland. That poem deals with many things, but most notably it addresses the loss of meaning, the implausibility of familiar idioms, and a general despair in the wake of World War I. Western civilization, or rather Western liberalism, had seen itself as advancing on an evolutionary path toward peace and liberty, and that had shown itself to be a lie. As Larkin put it much later in his poem 1914, never such innocence again. And the first thing to note is how different the structure is to our first poem, compared to our first poem. Though most of the first verse of the Second Coming is lines of 10 sounded syllables, it's not entirely regular, and the second verse abandons that length and rhythm entirely. The verses don't have the same number of lines either, and none of it rhymes, in terms of the end of each line. But it doesn't mean there isn't some structure to it. Indeed, it has a powerful rhythm, partly from the trick of how in English we generally choose to emphasise words in lines, like those of the poem. For instance, slouches toward Bethlehem to be born is more or less the natural way we would put emphasis in that line. It's not perfectly regular in terms of syllables, it's a more organic structure, more like speech, but somehow incredibly poetic as well. And those are the emotional keys to that sentence, the idea of the beach slouching, the reference to the birthplace of Jesus, Bethlehem, and the echo of the birth of Jesus, born, with the birth of the terrible beast. And Yeats also uses a lot of assonance and alliteration. A shape with lion body and the head of a man, a gaze blank and pitiless as the sun. Man and sun don't rhyme. Man and blank don't rhyme, in fact, but they do all sound similar, don't they? They're assonant. And what about 20 centuries of stony sleep? There's an internal rhyme there between 20 and centuries, and centuries, stony and sleep all have that soft S sound at the start, which is alliterative. So there's structure, but it's not based on a kind of rhyme pattern at the end of the lines. It's a lot more complicated, organic. And what about the themes? In many ways, it's what strikes us hardest, with those very famous lines about things falling apart and the rest. Well, we can see a general theme of anxiety or fear. Things are changing. Ordered civilization seems to be collapsing. Things fall apart. The centre cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. But what on earth is the second verse about? The first verse seems like a simple allegory for the breakdown of civilization. The second verse, is it an allegory for a specific historical figure, perhaps? Well, a clue for those who look at their Yeats, read about Yeats, is the word gyre in the first line. A gyre is a swelling vortex or an air current. So, of course, a falcon might be found there. But in 1919, as he wrote this poem, Yeats was getting into the idea of gyres as metaphysical vortices or cones of human history. And, Yeats was into lots of odd stuff, as Maud Gunn had been, and the idea of gyres came to him through his wife's mystical sleep talking. Don't ask. They showed how things changed in patterns and revolved or evolved. So Yeats believed humanity had reached in 1919 a key moment in history determined by these mystical gyres. And that's what the revelation is. That's what the inverted commas second coming is. And of course, the language is meant to make us think of Jesus' return. But for Yeats, that's because it is a poetic echo of the last key event, the rise of Christianity. 20 centuries, 2,000 years, had been kept quiet by the birth of Jesus. But now, the time of something else, a rough beast, something that drowns innocence, has arrived. Yeats has a mystical vision of it, that lion body with the head of a man. Very pagan image, isn't it? This is Sphinx-like. But whatever it turns out to be, the future is a dark one. The images are powerful. They constantly seem prophetic. As an example, in 2016, this poem was quoted more than in whole decades prior to it combined. But I suspect that Yeats would see everything since 1919 as fitting this pattern. To him, it isn't prophetic of a single event, but a whole movement in world history. So let's do one final comparison. We talked about Rose of the World as romantic. Here, this is a very modernist poem in lots of ways, I'd say. Formally, it is, in terms of its structure. And in terms of its content, not that mysticism is alien to romanticism at all, but this sort of heightened, feverish mysticism is certainly a development on it. The idea of a loss of meaning and of the chaos and despair at the end of an age, that's very modernist. A reconstruction of old images into something very fresh, compared to using Helen of Troy's image of beauty, for instance. Here, Yeats uses the incarnation of Jesus as a foreshadowing or echo or previous iteration in history of a disaster about to happen. That's very fresh. It's very modernist. That's a very modernist move. So here we have one author with two totally different kinds of poems. And partly the separation is mere time, his natural development, but partly it's also a change in civilization in that time. And you can map something that happened in Western civilization between 1893 and 1919 by reading these two poems. That's it from me. What do you think?